Hello everyone and welcome back to the show. My name's Dan, this Exploder. I'm here with another episode just for anybody who bothers to listen to this show. Thank you for always being there, listening to the shows and enjoying. And any way you can talk or any way you want to talk to me or let me know how you're feeling, whether you like it or you don't. Thank you for being here and listening to me talk about God knows what. In this episode, I want to talk about a little unique piece of wrestling history. I've always been fascinated with history of professional wrestling. I've done this in a previous episode. I'm predicting the future. In a previous episode, I talked about the constant clash between style and substance, between an actual wrestling sport and an entertainment package. And I've looked at those things. In this case, I've always liked that history. I've always liked looking at those things. This one, I want to talk about a very specific part of wrestling history, and it's a part of history that maybe isn't exactly the kind of history we want to go back to. Like, there's some things you say, oh, well, that used to be really good. Titles used to mean something. There used to be less of them. There used to be fewer pay-per-views, so every pay-per-view meant something more when you got to it, a SummerSlam or a Survivor Series or a WrestleMania or what have you. But then again, every once in a while, there's some kind of history that you look at that's just not the greatest. It's a part of history that it happened, and you acknowledge that it happened, but it's not necessarily something you want to go back to. In that case, with that in mind, I want to talk to you about the role of wild animals in professional wrestling. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was a wrestler who was 7 feet tall and weighed over 600 pounds. No, I'm not talking about Yokozuna in alternate reality. I'm talking about Terrible Ted, the wrestling bear. Now, according to whoever you ask, Terrible Ted was either born in 1949 or 1950. Now, for the sake of this, I'm probably going to say 1949 because of what I'm about to explain. As a cub, all of his teeth and claws were extracted, because at the time, no one gave a crap about what you did with wild animals apparently, and that was just something you could do to a wild animal. I'm not agreeing with it, I'm just stating a fact. Terrible Ted was a Canadian black bear who debuted in a carnival-like circuit in April 1st, 1950, wrestling in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and he defeated renowned dirty boxer Tony Galento. The two would eventually go back and have a rematch. Now, of course, Tony Galento is no relation to Mario Galento. While Tony Galento was known for being a very stringent yet, like I said, dirty boxer, and Mario Galento is known for being a goddamn lunatic. If you don't believe me, look it up. After a few years grappling on the carnival circuit, he was eventually purchased by a guy named Dave McKigney. This guy would eventually would be his trainer. He would be his opponent at times. He would be the referee. He would do these things. This was the guy who took Terrible Ted around the country, United States and Canada, and made him a household name. Many of the bouts during the time with McKigney were predetermined, as well as you can predetermine a match with a bear. I'm not sure how good of a worker a bear is, but for what it was. And then occasionally, McKigney would offer large sums of money to anyone in whatever town they were in if they could pin Terrible Ted. Now keep in mind, Terrible Ted was a 600-pound bear. So this requires a level of psychosis to even jump in the ring with him. Now, I don't care if he doesn't have claws. I don't care if he doesn't have teeth. The reality is, he was still a 600-pound bear. Strength alone should have been enough to keep you from jumping in there, but it didn't stop a lot of people, and believe me, you'll understand why. On July 13, 1966, McKigney offered $3,000 to anyone who could pin Ted. This was met by a guy named John Sigzetti, I'm probably saying that wrong, who was a 36-year-old welder who wanted the money for truck repairs, because what else would you wrestle a bear for? Duh, you need your truck repaired. So what do? Not overtime. Oh no, you wrestle a bear. That's how you did things back in 1966, and God knows where this guy lived. He was able to pin the bear for around 15 seconds, according to people that were there, before McKigney pried him off. McKigney and promoter Howard Darvin refused to pay the prize, so Sigzetti sued them in May of 1968. Could you imagine this scenario going into a small claims court, and you go into this court and you say, "Hey, the promoter and the guy of the bear I wrestled and beat didn't pay up, Your Honor." That's fun. You got like a couple jaywalking tickets, an occasional, flasher maybe, and then you got the guy suing the promoter because the bear he wrestled didn't pay up. Terrible Ted, of course, even spent a night in jail. Again, think of this. Spent a night in a different county jail because McKigney went back on an agreement to have the bear face a local 350-pound construction worker. Terrible Ted was being held as security until McKigney appeared in court. That's a real thing. A local jail put a bear in one of the cells to ensure that the promoter would come back in time. Again, wrestling used to be a wild, wild west, and this is a great example of that. Terrible example? I don't know. It's an example. Terrible Ted would remain a fan favorite of the wrestling world for between 1969 and 1974, and he wrestled a lot of big names, including superstar Billy Graham, who was a future WWF champion, Jerry Lawler, because of course, Bobby Heenan, Baron von Raschke, and a plucky guy named Rocky Johnson. It's really weird to think about that if a match with a bear went wrong, we wouldn't have The Rock. That's a weird alternate reality, but it's also a weird thing where if the match with the bear went wrong, the most electrifying man in sports entertainment and the guy who's currently in a Fast and Furious spinoff wouldn't be here because of bears. Again, that's just a weird reality. Terrible Ted even worked for Stampede Wrestling under the promotion of Stu Hart, and for a while lived under the porch of the famed Hart family home, according to Bret Hart, where the bear would often lick ice cream off of Hart's toes. Hart, of course, was a child at the time, so I want to get that out there. And second, if you take anything beyond that and you make it weird, that's more on you than it is anyone else. He would even work for the WWF in the early 1970s. So that's how far this got. This character would make its way around Canada, around the United States, and would even work for Vince McMahon Sr. That's how big of an act just Terrible Ted would be. Then in 1974, after 24 years of wrestling and participating in somewhere close to 1,000 matches, Terrible Ted actually retired, or allowed to retire, however you want to look the power dynamic. And then it gets sad. Now, I'm not here to argue the efficacy of a wrestling bear, and I think there's controversy that comes to the idea of having an animal wrestle, and like I said, it's something that is not currently done for obvious reasons, but it gets sadder than even that. In 1978, in Aurora, Ontario, Dave McKigney, his girlfriend, Terrible Ted, and another bear called Smokey, who was not a working bear, I guess, so he had all his teeth and claws. McKigney went to answer the telephone and left Smokey's cage door open, which Smokey proceeded to go into the house and remind McKigney that he lived with a goddamn bear and mauled his girlfriend to death. That's a real thing that happened. The Ontario Humane Society arrived on the scene, sees both Smokey and Terrible Ted, and then the history after that gets really murky because there's no record of what happened to them. All we do know is that Smokey was held in quarantine for 14 days because there's always a worry of a wild animal having rabies. And when they found that they didn't, all we know is that there's no record of them being euthanized. But what happened to them exactly in 1978, we don't know. There's really no record of what happened. All they know is they seized them, and then Terrible Ted and his companion Smokey there's no records. So what happened to them then, I don't know, which I think is a really weird way. I mean, if you think about, take the morals of a wrestling bear to the side. Can you name any other wrestler, and there's a couple, but it's very few, any other wrestler of any kind that just retires and then disappears, like literally disappears? There's no record of where they went. Not that they retired and opened a bait shop, or they ended up doing some god-awful Heroes of Wrestling pay-per-view or something like that, but just literally disappearing. That's very odd. Now, the controversies of this, there are a couple. Now, the first one is more logistical. The average lifespan of a black bear is between 10 and 30 years. So, if he were born, like I said, in 1949, and this happened in 1978, logically, this isn't the same bear. I mean, that's just really what it was. This isn't the same bear. There's no way. If he were born in 1949 and the attack happened in 1978, now could it happen? Maybe, but that would make him 29 years old. So a bear, 29. Now, of course, he wasn't the one who attacked, but for him to be healthy, again, between 10 and 30, and you're a 29-year-old bear, I don't know. That might not be the same bear. This is likely. There is a likely chance here that the supposed Terrible Ted was probably 2 or 3 bears, and this is another thing that'll show up in another topic, which I'll get to. The other problem with the act was, quite frankly, the same thing that happened with a lot of these things. animal welfare advocates came along in the 80s, and they started worrying more about bears and animals in general, sort of as circus acts. And so, the idea of a malnourished elephant clomping along in a circus, while in the 1950s and 60s, most people probably didn't care because it was a spectacle. Oh, come see the wrestling bear, come see the elephant or whatever. But by this time, by the 80s, people are coming along and going, well, but what's the welfare of those animals? How's the bear doing? This bear has no teeth, no claws. And whether it's the first bear or the second bear, it's irrelevant. It's what's the likelihood of that bear. So this is the same thing would show up. And there would be appearances by wrestling bears like Samson and later Caesar, who would be doing these wrestling matches. Samson was recently as the 80s, and Caesar was well up through 2010, which eventually he killed a trainer and had to be put down. But that's a whole different story. But of all this, what happened to Dave McKigney? The promoter, the guy behind this, the trainer, opponent, owner of Terrible Ted. We know that Terrible Ted sort of met this mysterious end and I assume died in the custody of a humane society, which is probably better than being in a cage next to a guy and his girlfriend and a guy who doesn't know how to lock a door on the cage of his deadly bear. But what happened to Dave McKigney? Now, this one's really interesting. I didn't know this part. I knew part of the story, but I didn't know the whole story. On July 4th, 1988, in Newfoundland, Canada, McKigney was in a car with William and Victor Arco, who wrestled as the Kelly twins, and Adrian Adonis in a van going to a show. William Arco was driving the car, driving the van as it were, and swerved to avoid hitting a moose because they were in Canada, and crashed the van. That killed his brother, Victor, that killed Dave McKigney, and Adrian Adonis. So anyone who knows Adrian Adonis, adorable Adrian Adonis, or what have you, the East-West Connection, or however you know him, he died on July 4th, 1988 in his van crash. Dave McKigney, the guy behind Terrible Ted, this is, of course, 10 years after the incident where Ted was taken away from him. 10 years later, he dies in a van crash in Canada with Adrian Adonis. So that's a little epilogue there. That's a that's a little ending story there. That's really interesting. I think I didn't know that connection. I really didn't know that connection until I read up on this, and I was like, holy crap, that's a weird connection. But there you go. That was the end of Dave McKigney, was a van crash that also killed Adrian Adonis in 1988. Just a little something to think about. And if one wrestling bear wasn't good enough for you, we've got two for the price of one. Of course, this show is free, so whatever you get's free. Victor the bear was another wrestling bear. I've said bear a lot. Victor was an Alaskan brown bear, and unlike Terrible Ted, Victor kept most of his teeth, which is also why he had to wear a muzzle during his matches. And I'll get to why later. But I'm going to start it with like this. I read an article like this on Deadspin about this, and I never really thought about the connection. You remember in 2008, the movie Will Ferrell played in a guy named Jackie Moon in a movie called Semi-Pro, where his character Jackie Moon was a team in the ABA, the Flint Tropics, I believe it was. And he's trying to come up with these gimmicks on how to get people to come to the games because anyway, I'm not going to explain the whole thing. If I have to explain a plot to a 2008 Will Ferrell movie, then the terrorists have won. Still, it's looking for gimmicks to get people in the door. One of the gimmicks he comes up with is at halftime of a game, he's going to wrestle a bear. Now that seems like a preposterous thing to do. Now, would you believe that it's happened in real life more than once? Because it has. In 1970, at an NBA game between the Chicago Bulls and the then San Francisco Warriors, Bulls general manager Pat Williams wrestled Victor the Bear and lost because executives do not equal bears. Apparently he was the control to find that out, and we found out quickly. Then again, on April 2nd, 1975, at halftime of an ABA game between the Utah Stars and the Indiana Pacers, Victor wrestled and beat WISH TV sports director Chet Kopic, because on any given day, a bear can definitely defeat a sports director. Take the biggest, toughest sports director you've ever seen in your life, put him against a bear, it's not even a contest. Oh, you know a lot about rugby. I don't care. It's a bear. Victor was owned by a wrestler named Tuffy Truesdell, who started out by wrestling alligators. At the time in the 50s, everyone was doing bear wrestling, apparently. So he saw Terrible Ted and went, nah, I can do dumber. Truesdell would wrestle alligators, but the way he did it was actually pretty, for wrestling alligators, he found a way to make it even more insane. He didn't hold their mouths shut. because, and I'm quoting here, he wanted to give the gator a fair chance. And he said, "I'm the only man in the world who wrestles alligators this way." And yes, he was. And there's good reason for that. He decided to give up wrestling alligators after a particularly nasty run-in with Rodney the wrestling alligator, who gave him 40 stitches. Okay, the alligator didn't give stitches. I imagine some kind of alligator doctor would be very weird. No, he clawed the crap and he bit him, I assume, or whatever, and left him with a wound that required 40 stitches, let me clarify. And then he went, I'm going to stop wrestling alligators. And that's a rational move. And then he made the rational decision to stop wrestling alligators and start wrestling bears. Wait, what? So this around the time he ended up with Victor the bear. Victor was a very giant bear, an Alaskan brown bear. He was declawed, as you expect. He was defanged. Now, defanged and all of his teeth taken are completely different things. So his major fangs were taken out, but he still had teeth. And again, I'm going to get to why. So because he still had teeth, he was fitted with a muzzle. There were arguments that he was probably drugged up a bit. I wouldn't put it past him. And the reality was he had a muzzle. He didn't have any claws. He was still a bear. And I know I specified this. I know I keep saying this, but I don't think people understand. At the time, they certainly didn't. He's still a bear. Without claws, without some of his teeth, with a muzzle on, it doesn't matter. They're giants and they are monsters and they are still dangerous. So even the people that got into the ring with him still had to understand this is still a bear and it's still dangerous to deal with. But enough people did, apparently. Enough people didn't quite understand the threat of a bear. And again, I'm going to explain exactly how many people didn't understand this. Most of the matches that Victor the Bear had lasted barely a minute. And when it was done, he would go to his corner and Tuffy Truesdell would hand him his reward, a bottle of Coca-Cola. Yeah, apparently this bear loved Coca-Cola to the point where he would put it in his paws, tip it up, and just inhale the bubbly beverage that we all know and love. Now, say what you will about bear wrestling. And again, I'm not saying I support it then or now, but that's kind of cute. I'm not gonna lie. That's if you saw that out of context, you're just like, oh yeah, the bear sitting in the corner just drinking a bottle of Coke. You're like, oh, that's pretty cool. That's a YouTube video. Say what you will, but yeah, it's pretty cute. Just like Terrible Ted, Victor would work matches, as well as a bear can work, but he would also take challenges from the crowd. When he did this, Truesdell would act as the referee. Now, when other people came from the crowd, he would make them sign a waiver that would not hold Truesdell responsible in case they were mauled by the bear they were wrestling. And apparently, bear wrestling was so popular at the time that they had to draw up legal paperwork for all the challengers. Because again, enough people thought I could take a bear, and that's a dumb thing to say. Again, I don't care if it's wearing a muzzle, and you'll find out that didn't really stop anything. I don't care if it has claws. It's still a giant. And it could rip you apart, okay? The claws make it easier, but it doesn't mean it can't do it without the claws. But despite the fact that they're wrestling an Alaskan brown bear, this bear wrestled thousands, possibly tens of thousands of people from the time it was born in the early 60s until it stopped wrestling in the 80s. This includes some celebrities like Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin, who supposedly, completely rumor, but supposedly tried the bear on the set of Paint Your Wagon, where the bear guest starred, I guess. Football player Dick Butkus. Then there were the pro wrestlers. We're talking about Roddy Piper, Gary Hart, Gorgeous George, Wahoo McDaniel, and of course Dick Beyer, the Destroyer, who was once disqualified for throwing an illegal punch at the bear. I'm just going to say this right now. I'm all for rules and old school traditions and things like that. And yes, a clenched fist is illegal in pro wrestling, but if you're wrestling a bear, let him throw the punches. You know why? Because it's not going to affect the bear. No disrespect to Dick Beyer, but his hardest shoot punch, a Ric Flair chop, anything, is not going to affect a bear. So, it's an illegal punch. Yeah, that's like saying, you hit him with the wrong side of the paper airplane. Who gives a crap? It's still a punch and he's still a bear. Let him do whatever he wants. Wins for Victor range anywhere from 2,000 to 50,000 wins, depending on who you believe, with 0 losses and 1 draw. And the draw is not even confirmed. It is often attributed to anyone from Don Leo Jonathan, who was a famous wrestler at the time, to a nameless pro football player who just ran around the ring until Victor got tired and laid down. As for the real record, we'll never really know, but we do know that he did actually lose a handful of times. In 1977, Victor lost to Olympic wrestler Jeffrey M. Hunt when he was pinned. This surprised even Truesdell, who up to that point thought it wasn't even possible. I mean, and to be fair, you can't blame him. 1981, former college wrestling champion Wayne Boyd, who by that point was 34 years old, defeated Victor. And then even Olympic canoeer Mike Herbert defeated the Wrestling Bear. A canoeer, a guy who did canoe professionally. Now, this one's a little bit controversial in a way. Herbert heard of this story where he was driving in his car and he heard that anyone who could pin the bear, anyone who could defeat the bear, I guess, would win a Camaro. And he hears this in his car, listening to the radio, which is a great time to decide to wrestle a bear in your car. You're driving the car and you go, you know what I'm going to do? Wrestle a bear. That's a great life decision you made. Herbert would go to a draw in the first match, and then the second match, the rules were changed to where he had to get a 3 count. The first match was only a 1 count, which apparently he didn't do. The second match was supposed to be a 3 count, like professional wrestling, and he only pinned the bear for 2.5 seconds, which wasn't quite winning against a bear. So he never got the Camaro, but he did get to tell the story of the 2 times he wrestled a bear and lived to tell this tale. So there's that. Now, again, we're talking about the lifespan of bears. So in this case, and this one's more of a confirmed, there were at least 2 to 3 Victor the Bears. The first Victor died of a heart attack at the age of 17 in the mid-70s, like many people, and he was replaced by Victor II, who kept the same lineage, same win-loss record, and as far as the public knew, was the same bear. Victor II, I guess, would continue wrestling well into the 80s, but eventually, as was the case only a little later, but as the case was with Terrible Ted, time caught up with the act. Society started caring more about the welfare of animals, and there was a spectacle of seeing a bear wrestle a man, and maybe that got tired, and maybe it was a combination of the two. It got tired, plus people were worried about, what's this bear like? What's this life like for this bear traveling around the country and wrestling people? And I mean, it can't be fun. It can't be enjoyable. It's a bear. And then, of course, came 1981. It was a really bad year for Victor the Wrestling Bear and Tuffy Truesdell. After thousands of matches with very few injuries, 2 of them occurred within weeks of each other. An unnamed 24-year-old came away from a match with a fractured ankle and damaged cartilage and ligaments, which is not good. But the big one happened in September of 1981 when Army Corporal Charles G. Smith was wrestling Victor when his left hand managed to slip inside Victor's muzzle. I've mentioned the muzzle, and I've mentioned by at the end of the day it didn't really matter. The bear chomped down with his back teeth. Remember, back teeth, still had some teeth, and bit most of his left pinky finger clean off. This left Smith with a unmoving stump where the pinky used to be. Smith's lawyer, well, of course he's going to sue, Smith's lawyer said that the trainer Truesdell walked over, scooped up the finger, handed it to Smith, and then told him to get out of the ring. That's the kind of care he had for the guy who just got his finger bitten off by his bear. Smith sued Truesdell and won because, well, it's hard to say, hey, that bear I was in the ring with, yeah, he bit my finger off. I take you to Exhibit A, the stump where my finger used to be, and Exhibit B, the bear. It also didn't help that Truesdell didn't even show up to court, so that made victory a lot easier. That was probably a 10-minute trial. Victor would lose his wrestling license in Virginia, and then several venues started turning him away. They wouldn't accommodate him. Protesters got louder and more frequent about the treatment. Now, the problem was the federal government said, well, the bear's not being abused. There was no evidence that the bear was being abused outside of the wrestling thing. He wasn't being malnourished. He wasn't being beaten. There's no proof of any of that. So the federal government didn't step in because as far as they saw, everyone getting in the ring with him was a volunteer. The bear was the legal ownership of Tuffy Truesdell, and there's no proof that Truesdell was abusing him. So although people in public were not happy with the act and they were protesting, as was their legal right, and the act was again getting old and sort of moving on, the government said they had no legal authority to do anything about it. But the act, like I said, the act had got tired and sort of it went away. And like I said, it's like anything else, it went away. And people started caring more about the animal, and the act had got stale. It had been, I mean, think of this, Terrible Ted started in the 50s. Now we're talking 30 years later where Victor the Bear is taken over. And it's kind of thing where it's 30 years of it, and it's fine it's fine the first time you see it. But many years later, plus venues aren't really interested in having all these protesters. Plus the act has got stale. Once put it all together, and it's something that wasn't going to last, quite frankly. So Victor the Bear went the way of Terrible Ted a decade before. It just got to the point where the act was stale. There was a public outcry against it, and well, it didn't last for obvious reasons. But what about the other animals that made their way into professional wrestling during very much the same time? There's stories, of course, about legendary promoter of Stampede Wrestling, Stu Hart, wrestling a tiger named Sasha that was performed publicly as part of a publicity stunt for the Calgary Stampede. And this was on behalf of the Calgary Fish and Wildlife Association. So apparently, if you're in Canada and you want to wrestle a wild animal, you go to Calgary. That's how that works. You go to Calgary and you stay clear of Ontario, I guess. That's really the explanation here. If you want to really wrestle an animal, at least back then, you went to Calgary and you left Ontario alone. And then, of course, there's a very interesting story, which one I literally had no clue about. Apparently, years and years ago, before he became the WWF champion that we all know and love, Bruno Sammartino, as a young wrestler, wrestled an orangutan in a match. The match lasted for 15 minutes, with Sammartino earning $25 for each 5 minutes he could last. Sammartino later expressed that he was under the impression that the ape would be a monkey. I'm not sure why that matters. And that he only took the match because he was relatively desperate for money, being a young wrestler at the time, not making a whole lot himself. He also said that the match was unsafe because, and I'm saying this exactly how he said it, the orangutan was not trained to perform. So I'm going to say this, and far be it for me to question the wisdom of Bruno Sammartino, but how well trained did he think an orangutan could be to wrestle a grown man? And Bruno Sammartino, even as a young guy, he was a bodybuilder. He was a big, muscly guy. He may not have been as famous as he'd become, but he was still a big, muscly guy. How well do you think you could train? Could you get an orangutan to take a bump? Do an arm drag? Like, how well trained did that orangutan have to be to where this wasn't just an absurd match? I don't know. I'm just going to leave that there. Anyway, that's the end of this topic. That is the role or the history, I guess, of animals in wrestling. Again, not something we really look back on and say, oh man, I wish that was coming back. But it's something that's very interesting that's happened. And you look back and you go, wow, that was kind of weird. And you get a couple funny stories in there, but it's not something you necessarily want to go back to. But it's still interesting to look at in history, in that historical context. If you have any ideas for another show, for another topic, anything you want to talk about, send me some comments, death threats. Tell me how much you really love Virgil, you sick bastards. Whatever it is, send it to the page, rate us, if whatever we're on, give us 5 stars or a heart or whatever the metric is on whatever system you're listening to, Stitcher, Podbean, iTunes, what have you. If you're watching on Facebook and the video or the audio version or whatever, post a comment, tell me what you think, tell me how I'm doing. Just engage. I want some more engagement on this page. I feel like a lot of the things I'm talking about, but I don't feel like there's a lot of engagement with the people that are listening. So if you have something to say, whether you agree with me or not, if you disagree with me, it's even better. If you disagree with me on something, or you think I didn't talk about something enough or whatever, let me know. And maybe we'll talk about it in a future episode. With that said, until next time, my name's Dan. This is Exploder. Have a good one.